it's Alabama Annie with another episode of the Starlight Tavern. This is part 30, and it's one of my books available on Kindle. Charlie Teal decided it was time for him to get his cash from the tavern one way or the other if it was still there. True, the last time he'd seen any of the people at the tavern, Mary had thrown him out for fighting with Robert over that poker game. But he took his chances and drove out of Tennessee onto Lookout Mountain. He arrived unannounced at the tavern that February morning, and to his surprise, Mary actually seemed happy to see him when she answered the door. She invited him to stay with them, and Charlie knew no one would look for him there, so he'd taken her up on the offer and settled into that same corner room he'd stayed in years before. He was now, though, romancing his best friend's widow, who seemed unaware of the real reason for his visit. Charlie didn't like having the Bells around. He'd never liked Miss Hattie very much at all, and the feeling was mutual. He'd butted heads with Uncle John and Mr. Harvey more than once, and he and Robert had never seen eye to eye on their living conditions, like so many folks in Starlight. Robert had thought it was just fine that it wasn't the way things were done where Charlie came from down in Savannah, where there was a great separation between blacks and whites. But the Bells didn't bother him half as much as having the damn kids around. He hadn't counted on Robert's widow taking in me or Lenny Payne, and he asked himself what kind of man would have dumped his boy on Aunt Mary too. He just didn't realize the relationship they had. Kids could swoop in and be nosy, and one thing was for certain. He didn't intend on being found out. He wasn't ever going back to prison, and he wasn't going to get the money he'd left there by sitting on his duff. And for all intents and purposes, he pretended he was broke when he arrived in Starlight. He'd given Aunt Mary a sob story right off the big bat about being down on his luck, and that I'd happened to have overheard about him being broke, and she'd offered to take him in despite the fact that we were struggling ourselves to make ends meet. But Charlie seemed to have had just enough Mississippi cash to wine and dine her for a while and buy her a trinket or two. But in the 2 weeks he'd been at the tavern, he hadn't had a single chance to go down to the cellar and look for his money, yet almost every day he'd tried. There were always too many people around, coming and going at all hours, and there was also the problem of getting down into the cellar in the first place. But he knew eventually that the right moment would present itself, so he told himself to be patient, and finally, after a few weeks of waiting, Charlie Teal got his chance to go and look for his loot. That Monday, Lenny and I got up and ate our breakfast. We dressed and headed off to school. And while Charlie and Aunt Mary and the guests were eating breakfast in the dining room, Miss Hattie came in to tell us that her sister over in Dogtown was sick and that they were going over there. So she said they were leaving just as soon as they got dressed, and said they would probably be gone for the rest of the day, maybe even overnight. Don't worry about anything, Aunt Mary said, and told her she hoped her sister would be better soon. Then, after the guests packed up and left the tavern, Mary took care of their rooms and remade the beds, bringing down the laundry before telling Charlie that she was going with Myra and Patsy on their weekly women's club meeting at a diner near Georgia, and she went off to get dressed. And could he manage alone for the day? Charlie found himself alone at the tavern for the first time since he'd arrived, and he took full advantage of the situation just as soon as he was sure they were all gone. He went up to his room and pulled on his boots and some old clothes, and went out the kitchen door and off the porch into the yard, and walked around to the little door below the porch that led into the cellar and slid open the latch. He pulled open the squeaky door with some effort and peered into the pitch black darkness. He'd need a light to go down there, so he went to the barn and found a kerosene lantern. He brought it back to the cellar door and lit it. He bent down and crawled inside, shoving along the cobwebs and even the skeleton of a dead animal as he made his way under the porch, almost falling into the fetid water of the cistern before finding his way around it and through the small opening into the cellar itself. He ducked his head and shoulders until he came to that rickety old shelf tacked to the back wall of the house and the overturned crates where Robert used to stash loads of whiskey he sold to his guests all those years before. He looked down below the table and all the old wooden crates and boxes, and just when he was about to give up, he found it. The satchel was covered in cobwebs, and it seemed to be right where he and Robert had left it that day. Charlie grabbed it up, pulled it from the crate, and opened the latch, and there, below a shirt he recalled having stuffed on top of the cash, were stacks and stacks of 50s and 100s, just like he'd left them. "Attaboy, Robert," he exclaimed, smiling as he closed the bag and slowly made his way back the way he had come, crawling toward the little door to the outside, and he'd almost made it through when he felt a sharp pain in his left knee and looked down to see that he'd cut himself on a piece of broken glass. Charlie let out a string of cuss words as he crawled out into the morning sun again and took a look at his knee, but it wasn't so bad. So he stood up and brushed off his clothes and the bag before closing the little door again, tamping down the grass and throwing loose leaves around the door so that it wasn't easy to tell it had ever been disturbed. He slid the latch back in place. He took the lantern back to the barn and returned to the kitchen door. He went inside again and even helped himself to another cup of coffee and had his kitchen with that bag of money sitting right there on her kitchen table. He took his time before he returned to his room. He looked around the room and walked toward his closet. He shoved the bag of money into the back behind his suitcase and some dirty clothes, and he closed the door. He was filthy, so he stripped off his dirty clothes and shoes and then saw the nasty gash on the side of his knee. So he went to the bathroom with some clean clothes. He ran himself a bath while he opened the medicine cabinet and brought out some alcohol, gauze, tape, and a Band-Aid, as well as some antibiotic powders that he would use to doctor it after his bath. Charlie Teal went to take his bath with a big smile on his unshaven face. Pretty soon, he thought to himself, he'd make an excuse and get out of this dump. Maybe he'd head east this time. He'd heard Charleston was a nice place to be in summer. He didn't want anyone cleaning his room while he was there. They just had no business, and chances were that they might look in his closet and find that bag of money, and what with all the guests they might have, and people coming and going in the rooms upstairs at the tavern as well, and those damn kids running around all the time. He never strayed too far, and he always locked the door to his room if he did. He dried himself off and then doctored his leg, cleaning the gash with a little of the gauze and some alcohol, and shook on some of the antibiotic powder, and then put his bloody gauze into the trash can before he taped the wound shut and got dressed. Then, that weekend, William Post passed away suddenly. Aunt Mary was the one who found him in the corner room downstairs. He'd passed away in his sleep, Leonard said, and they made arrangements for his service and burial. Several old-timers came from all over the mountain and even from as far away as Kentucky and Tennessee when they learned William had passed, and our parlor was filled with pipe smoke and old stories from back in the day, and I just didn't realize how well-liked William had been until I'd heard those stories. It was the oddest thing. The morning after we stood at his graveside, I woke to find a single piece of peppermint candy laying on my bedside table, and I just knew that was William's way of saying goodbye to me. A few days later, we came home from school one afternoon and knew something was going on, but we didn't know quite what. When we came through the dining room into the kitchen, Miss Hattie met us and told us to sit down at the table, but she didn't offer us anything to eat or drink, and she wasn't smiling. She told us to just stay where we were. I gave Lenny a puzzled look and whispered, "What have we done?" And he shook his head at me and said, "Beats me," just as Aunt Mary and Uncle John came through the back door. They all sat down at the table with us. John looked at the both of us and said, "Today when Harvey was weeding around the porch, he noticed that the side door to the cellar had been opened and that somebody has been down there. And I just wanted to know if it could have been either of you," he said. "We all know that you should never go down there. There's broken glass and everything everywhere, and it's dangerous, not to mention the snakes and the spiders. So I need you both to tell me the truth. Have you been snooping around in the cellar for some reason?" he asked. "No, sir, it wasn't me." And I told them I'd never been down there in my life except for the one time when he'd showed it to me. I said I peeked in that one time, and I never wanted to go there again. I didn't like the thought of spiders. I liked crickets and lizards, okay, and even some friendly snakes I'd seen around the garden, but I hated spiders. "It wasn't me," I announced, and he looked at Lenny. "No, sir, it sure wasn't me. I don't have time, nor do I want to go under the porch." "Well, then who's been under the porch?" Harvey spoke up. "It could have been some tramp looking for a place to sleep, or those hill boys from over behind the hotel who ramble all over the place every night. They could be trying to steal something again," he suggested, reminding Uncle John that he'd noticed some things had been moved in the barn. He stood up, pouring himself a glass of tea, and Uncle John took off his glasses and looked around the table, rubbing his eyes. "All right, then. We have to assume someone is trying to steal things from us again, so we'll always see that the barn is locked up at night and that all of the doors to the tavern are locked as well. And Harvey has closed the cellar door so it won't be opening anytime soon," he announced as Miss Hattie looked over at Aunt Mary. "What about Charlie? Would he have gone under there for some reason?" she asked, and said she thought he might be sitting here right now if he was doing the right thing. But Aunt Mary said he wasn't involved in that, and why would he? "Charlie would have no reason to go under that dank old cellar that I can think of," she told him, while in the back of her mind she wondered if he did have some reason to go into the cellar. Miss Hattie stood up and put her hands on her hips. "Well, now that's cleared up and we know that King Charlie is innocent, what would you kids like to have as a snack before you do your homework?" she asked, as Lenny said he'd like cookies and milk, and I wanted some crackers and juice. Aunt Mary went over to the stove and stirred something in a pot, while Uncle John and Harvey went back outside, and Hattie poured herself another cup of coffee and helped me with my math for a while. Later that night at dinner, Charlie didn't have much to say, but when Uncle John said he wondered who could have gone under the porch into the cellar, Charlie did comment that he'd been over to the store that afternoon and he'd heard something about a tramp roaming around. After dinner, when Charlie got up to go out to the porch and smoke, Aunt Mary noticed that he was limping slightly and asked him what was wrong. She was watching him closely. "Oh, I just hurt my bum knee," he commented.